Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be one of you at the 24th TCFA annual conference. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mr. Greg Allen, President of the U.S.-China Business Council. USCBC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization representing over 200 major American companies doing business in China. Before he began at USCBC, Greg had a long and distinguished career in U.S. public service. Greg Allen started his government career in 1985 at the Department of Commerce International Trade Administration. From 1986 to 1988, he worked as an international economist in the ITA China office. In 1988, Craig transferred to the American Institute in Taiwan, and he served as director of the American Trade Center in Taipei. In 1992, he returned to the Department of Commerce for 3 years posting in Beijing as commercial attaché, responsible for the chemical sector, consumer goods, and medical equipment. In 1995, Craig moved from China to a new posting in Tokyo, where he served as a commercial attaché with responsibilities for consumer goods and standards. In 1998, he was promoted to Deputy Senior Commercial Officer with responsibility for the entire section. In 1999, Greg became a member of the Senior Foreign Service. In 2000, Craig departed Tokyo for a 2-year tour of duty at the National Center for APEC in Seattle, where after that, Craig went back to China and managed the entire complement of 126 staff of Department of Commerce in Beijing, where he was promoted to the Minister Consular rank of the Senior Foreign Service. After another tour in South Africa and a position as Deputy Assistant Secretary for China at the ITA, Ambassador Greg Allen was sworn in as a United States Ambassador to Brunei Darussalam on December 19, 2014. He served there with distinction until his term of appointment ended in mid-July 2018. He then transitioned to a non-government position as the president of the U.S.-China Business Council. Craig received a BA from the University of Michigan in Political Science and Asian Studies in 1979. He received a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University in 1985. Let us give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Greg Allen.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction, although it does make me feel old. Great to be here. 大家早上好. Hope that you have a great conference. So I am a former trade diplomat, recently retired after 33 years. Thank you for articulating that in the U.S. Foreign Service. And I'm fortunate now to work for an organization that represents the views of American companies, mostly those who are invested in China. Many of the companies that you work for are members of the U.S.-China Business Council. We have a total of 220 members, including many financial firms. Our chairman is Evan Greenberg, the chairman of the Chubb Group of insurance companies, and our vice chairs are the chairman of General Motors and the chairman of Walmart. Our mission is to advocate on behalf of American business in China. So we're in very close touch with both governments. We support the Trump administration's objectives of greater market access in China, but we do not support the Trump administration's use of tariffs as a trade tool. In my view, building bridges for American business into China is an important and a very worthy endeavor, as business, trade, and investment are the firm foundations upon which the U.S.-China bilateral relationship rests. So I just returned from Shanghai about 36 hours ago, Friday night, after attending the opening of the China International Import Exposition, opened by President Xi Jinping. Last week, Vice President Wang made some very interesting remarks in Singapore at the Bloomberg conference, and I highly recommend that you take the time to read those remarks. Very good, excellent remarks. Last week, there was also a friendly call between President Trump and President Xi in preparation for their expected meeting that Henry referenced in Argentina on December 1. This phone call last week was important. It signaled to both governments and their peoples that the two leaders wished to move forward toward a successful meeting only 21 days from now. And that does not give the governments a long time to prepare. The U.S.-China relationship has been undergoing unprecedented tension and stress of late, and we're certainly in the middle of a trade skirmish, if not the first stages of a trade war. Clearly, we're at an inflection point in the bilateral relationship, and I really appreciated Henry's optimism about how this will turn out. Thus, what happens on December 1 in Argentina when President Xi and President Trump meet will be enormously consequential to the bilateral relationship, to regional security, and I would argue to global financial stability. So why are we here? What will happen before the meeting in Argentina? What is the likelihood of a successful meeting in Argentina? How would both sides define success? What are the possibilities of failure? And what would be the consequences of failure? So let me start at the beginning. Why are we here? The trade tensions between the U.S. and China are not new. Under the Obama administration, they were just handled very differently. So President Obama reacted to the challenge from China in a very positive manner, that is, working on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, and also negotiating with China a bilateral investment treaty, or a BIT, which we came very close to signing but did not sign. And also, of course, the Obama administration worked very aggressively and robustly within the WTO framework. Now, President Trump forcefully rejected every aspect of this framework as ineffective and globalist, and President Trump has chosen a much more direct and indeed confrontational approach. So from a Washington perspective, what are the problems that we seek to address? We can sum this up by saying that the Chinese economic model, which the Chinese Communist Party itself calls the social market economy with Chinese characteristics, may not be compatible with the WTO. So 20 years ago, when China joined the WTO, it really didn't matter. China was too small. But in 20 short years, over the course of only a single generation, China has become the world's largest trading country and also the world's largest industrial or manufacturing country. And thus, if indeed China is engaged in WTO non-compliant behavior, then perhaps we do have a systemic global problem. over the last few years, there has been a consensus that has developed in Washington, Europe, Japan, and I would argue broadly across the world, that Beijing was not taking the WTO concerns seriously, that the negotiations were not fruitful, and that indeed the reform and opening process had, if not been stopped, had certainly been slowed. Further, there is very palpable concern in Washington about high technology, that China was becoming more assertive at taking steps that would lead to Chinese dominance in high technology sectors over time. So are these concerns valid, or are they exaggerated or overblown? Well, I think that they are widely shared among many countries, especially among our European and our Japanese friends. But overall, I think it's fair to say that there is a global consensus that the model that China has followed, at least heretofore, is basically a mercantilist model, and that this policy is no longer sustainable, and it will not lead to continued growth in the Chinese economy. So is China non-compatible with the WTO? Certainly, if you ask any Chinese official, they will forcefully rebut that accusation. China's trade and foreign officials argue that they are WTO compliant, at least in a narrow, technical, and legal sense. They argue that if they are not explicitly breaking the WTO rules, then they should be left alone to do whatever they wish, even if that may be in violation of the spirit of the WTO. Now, lawyers can argue these points for eternity. But American government officials, particularly now with the Trump administration, have responded to China's unique form of governance, that is, the socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, with the assumption that it is essentially incompatible with the WTO. The WTO was not built for and cannot withstand the world's largest manufacturer and the world's largest trading country with an outlier in terms of economic models such as China. So the specific complaints that have been raised about the Chinese socialist market economy model are the following. Firstly, there is an outsized role of the party and the government in the economy that is orders of magnitude larger than any other OECD country. There's a lack of an independent judicial system and due recourse. The protected role of state-owned enterprises is a concern both domestically in China, where they can operate in an oligopolistic manner, and overseas, where there is coordination oftentimes between the SOEs. There is certainly a very tight relationship between the party, the state-owned enterprises, and the regulators, and that tight relationship does not help private sector Chinese companies or foreign companies. There's a lack of unbiased implementation of IPR rights. The state has acquired and manipulates industrial standards, sometimes quite aggressively. The state has enormous reserves for subsidies, especially in pursuit of technological dominance. And increasingly evident, we see a form of techno-nationalism, which sometimes leads to charges of forced technology transfer. And then finally, I would add, in the Chinese model, there's very tight, I would argue, excessive controls over media and the information space. So the Trump administration believes that many of these issues are not even covered they're not even mentioned in the WTO, and therefore dispute resolution mechanism under the WTO would not be effective. So the Trump administration used Section 301 under American trade law to impose tariffs on China to encourage change. This led to counter tariffs by China and counter tariffs by the U.S., which were then matched again by the Chinese. Today, 50%, over 50% of total trade going both ways is subject to these tariffs. Now, if this were not bad enough, and it's, I think, pretty bad, President Trump has threatened to move to a higher level of tariffs on January 1 if China does not address a list of questions or a list of concerns that have been raised. And then the administration may start a process early in the new year to implement tariffs across all of China's imports. And please do not believe that this is an idle threat. This is a real possibility, and I'm recommending to all of my members that they should indeed be prepared for this scenario. So how has China reacted? Well, I have three observations. The first observation is that China is prepared for an extended conflict. China is ready. And as evidence, I would submit to you that the central bank has reduced the reserve requirements 4 times. In doing so, China has effectively suspended the deleveraging program and is increasing debt. Also, China has expanded the fiscal stimulus, especially in 3rd and 4th tier cities. They are providing relief to stricken industries and allowing a weakening of the currency. So China is prepared for a conflict and an extended conflict. The second thing that China is doing is they are retaliating, but retaliating in a very careful, precise, and calculating manner. So traditionally, China has always engaged in tit-for-tat trade negotiating strategy. If you hit China, they will hit back a little bit harder. That has always been the case. And we have seen that with the Trump administration, that tariffs have ratcheted higher on both sides. And so nothing has changed there. But now, in addition to that, the Chinese are giving European and Japanese companies benefits that are not given to American companies. They have also, the Chinese government is trying to reduce reliance on American high technology products, witness the ZTE case. And the Chinese government has threatened the use of qualitative measures or non-tariff barriers against American investments in China if this conflict becomes extended. But I would have to emphasize that here to date, that the Chinese government has been very careful to protect American companies' property rights in China. There have been no meaningful, no large retaliation, despite very, very strong nationalist sentiment in China. So the third reaction of the Xi Jinping government was alluded to by Henry, and that is that indeed, quietly, they are implementing reforms that create greater market access. Over the last 2 or 3 months, a few things have happened. Firstly, they have eliminated market capitalization requirements for joint ventures in a couple of industries, including automotive and financial services. Very importantly and significantly, they've lowered duties on many import-sensitive industries such as cosmetics and autos, and not lowered duties a little bit, but by 50%. And that goes directly to the bottom line. That is a big change, but it has been very little noted in Western media. So I guess it's my job to talk about it. Also, China has eliminated many import licenses. In the important medical and pharmaceutical area, the Chinese are now allowing the use of foreign clinical data and also reimbursing orphan drugs. And all of these are $1 billion or more of impact to American companies. They're significant, but again, nobody is talking about it, well, except me. So I do think it's empirically important, and it must be noted. Also, I would notice just on Friday, so just a couple of days ago, the first American credit card company was approved by the PBOC. So is this a signal? And should we be expecting more signals or more approvals in the very near future? So in my view, these economic reforms are important. Potentially they're worth billions of dollars of U.S. exports and tens of thousands of jobs. But they suggest that Beijing is ready to deal. So the recent negotiating history between the two sides has been very rocky at best. I won't go over this in detail, but let's just say both sides have miscalculated, and that until this week, the two governments were not engaged in discussions at all. So are we on the road to a full-fledged trade war or a Cold War, or is there an off-ramp? And if so, what is the landing zone for the potential negotiations? Well, as I said, it looked pretty bleak until last week when the two presidents spoke over the phone, and it was announced that State Councilor Yang Jiechi would visit Washington last Friday, 2 days ago. Our Chinese contacts told us that the plan is that if the Yang Jiechi visit went well, then either Vice President Wang or Vice Premier Liu He will visit shortly thereafter. And then can we get to yes at the G20 in Argentina? So what are the prospects for getting to yes? So in his speech on Monday, Xi Jinping at the CIIE made very, I think, interesting remarks that China would be importing trillions of dollars of goods over the near term, and the Chinese market would become much more market access friendly to foreign trading partners, and he made some specific comments that broke new ground. He said that China would be liberalizing its telecommunications market. He said that China would be liberalizing its e-commerce market, further cutting tariffs from the current 7.5% to yet a lower level. He noted that China would completely abolish the market equity capitalization limits, would treat foreign companies the same as Chinese companies, including state-owned companies, I presume, under Chinese law, and attack Chinese counterfeits more aggressively. Coincidentally, these are many of the same items on the U.S. list that was given to China. Now, President Xi did not reference President Trump in his speech at CIIE, but I think that he has shown tremendous tactical flexibility, and our Chinese friends are working hard to address, at least nominally, the concerns of China's trading partners. So in my discussions with the Chinese, they summarize their position by saying that they are willing to change their, quote, policies, end quote, but not change their system, quote and end quote. While this sounds good, it's actually pretty vague. What is a policy and what is the system, and how do you differentiate between the two? Please note that President Xi did not mention in his speech the role of the party in the economy, state-owned enterprises, or Made in China 2025. Are these part of the system and therefore off the table, or are they part of policies and therefore negotiable? And I think that we're going to find out in the not so distant futures. So before we will be having a summit meeting only 21 days from now, and there are a couple of important events before them. APEC and the 40th anniversary of opening and reform. And I expect that President Xi will roll out some additional new announcements at both of these events. But how detailed will they be? Will they be vague and without a timeline, or will they be practicable, implementable, and time-bound? Will they really help foreign trading markets, trading partners? Will they move markets? Will they force American and European companies to get up and cheer? We shall see. The answers to these questions are important because the answers to the question will set the stage. Can President Xi and President Trump get to yes in Argentina? Now, if this were only a trade issue, as Henry kind of alluded to, I think that the answer is probably, yeah, we can get an agreement, but it's not only trade. National security issues have become more and more important. And this started in the beginning of the Trump administration when the national security strategy and the U.S. national defense strategy defined the evolving relationship of China and Russia together as strategic competitors. Previous administrations considered China both a competitor and a cooperator. Well, now China has been named a strategic competitor. The Chinese have noticed this, and they are reacting in kind. So I cannot go through the list of security concerns by both sides, but let me say that they are quite profound and important. And in case you are overly optimistic about an agreement in Buenos Aires, I ask you to please keep the security concerns in mind. In summary, on the Chinese side, my Chinese friends are asking, is the United States trying to contain China? Has the U.S. relationship with Taiwan changed? What about the increased U.S. military activities in the South China Sea? Mixing trade and security, the ZTE case is instructive. Will there be higher export controls and higher investment controls in the future? So in the U.S., we are equally concerned about on the national security side. Cyber theft and cases of forced technology transfer remain a huge concern. Overcapacity in steel and aluminum may have profound consequences in the military industry. Made in China 2025 has given us a pause. Is China aiming for dominance throughout the high-tech industries? So I would have to say that there is a great deal of concern on both sides. So let me just run through for a couple more minutes, maybe 2 minutes if I may. What would a deal look like in Argentina? Well, I think that there would be 5 components. The first is that there would be major purchases by China to reduce the bilateral trade deficit. And these are pretty well known. China could purchase hundreds of millions, tens of billions of dollars of soybean, cotton, corn, LNG, oil over the next few years. The second part of the agreement would probably include liberalizations in the immediate and short term along the lines of what Xi Jinping mentioned in Shanghai last week. Again, this is not so controversial as Xi Jinping will frame it as previously anticipated steps in the opening and reform process. The third part of the package would have to include a schedule and agenda for talks on the medium and longer term issues, such as SOE reform, industrial policy, excess capacity, and macroeconomic subjects such as China's excess savings could be covered here as well. And fourth, there are probably going to be some areas that we're not not going to agree, particularly in the national security sensitive areas. So we will need a process to manage those disagreements. What would that process be? And finally, we need a process to talk about WTO reform. So I'm cautiously optimistic that an agreement will be reached, despite the very difficult negotiating dynamics. Both sides can claim a win if they do reach an agreement, and indeed President Trump will have met his original goals with such an agreement, accomplishing something that his predecessors could not reach. And President Xi will be able to say that he's managed a very difficult bilateral situation well, and that China will now confidently move on to the next stage of opening and reform. Also by now, I hope that everyone realizes that the consequences of no agreement could be very large. A higher level of tariffs will be inflationary, especially for lower income people. They will force the Fed to increase interest rates even more rapidly than currently expected. That will have an impact on exchange rates, which will not be welcome in emerging markets like Argentina. It will tear at the economic architecture of Asia and the WTO, and it could have other negative bilateral consequences on the security side, for example, that could spill well over the economic lane. So there's a big upside and a huge downside here, but I am still only cautiously optimistic. There are a lot of challenges over the next 3 weeks. Can our Chinese diplomats, friends, put together a package of reforms that is actually convincing? How would that be announced to the Chinese, the Chinese world and to APEC or to the 40th anniversary in a manner that Xi Jinping would find appropriate? How about the concerns on the national security issues on both sides? Do they preclude an agreement on the trade issues? What's in it for China? How can the two sides ensure that an agreement seems balanced so that Xi Jinping is comfortable packaging the deal as a win? And finally, I worry how stable an agreement will be in the face of such distrust and concern over the national security issues. So these are not simple questions, and it will take enormous goodwill, political will, and tremendous skill by our negotiators to reach a final agreement in Buenos Aires only 21 days from now. Let us wish them well. Thank you.